All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name's Tom Lyons, and our webinar today is going to be based on virtualization and SIP, specifically why you should virtualize for SIP and what to expect, as well as when to contact our team to help you out. So this will give you what you need in order to get going with your SIP platform. So let's go ahead and take a look here through our agenda and talk about what we're going to go over today. So our agenda today is going to be who is Inflow Communications. So we're going to talk a little bit about us and what you can expect from us and how we can assist you there, as well as why you would want to go SIP. A little bit about SIP itself and what it is. Then we're going to talk about the virtual architecture, why it's more of a better way to go about handling SIP versus the physical switches in the architecture that you have right now, the supported virtualization platforms that we can use, and also when to contact us about different changes, what you're looking to do, and how we can assist you through the process. So a little bit about Inflow as we get going here. Inflow Communications for 11 years has been focused on contact center and unified communication solutions. Voice is what we do. So we don't jump into networking technologies or any other facets like that. As a result, when you give us a call, you are going to be directly connected with an engineer that's going to be well versed in your platform and will be able to assist you. We have over 50 employees headquartered in Portland, Oregon, but we are 100% remote and in field. We currently service over 260,000 endpoints and over 800 customers nationwide and in many cases worldwide. And we operate with speed, urgency, and agility. We want to get you all the information you would ever need and then some as fast as possible to make sure that your application is going to work exactly the way that you need it to. And we have full lifecycle guides to the UC, the CC, and the CX spaces. Here's a quick snippet of some of the customers that we support. You can see that we focus on mission critical communications and like to work with strategic decision makers. We value partnerships with our customers, and we typically target mid-market and enterprise level. And here's a few of the partners that we work with as well. So we're going to jump right into it here real quick. And this webinar is designed to give you an overview of SIP on a very high level, as well as talk about what is going to be required to move to a virtual state with SIP, why it's better, and also what we can do on the Inflow side to help you get to that part of the transition. So we're going to start real quick with a very brief overview of what SIP is to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about here. So SIP, or Session Initiation Protocol, is a network-based technology that's used to deliver calls. So this is something that is currently overtaking the PRI space that was heavily prevalent in the business world for many, many years. This is just a network-based way to deliver calls in the same way that PRIs do. So it's still a digital format, but because it's over the network, you don't even need a directly connected piece of equipment in order to do this. Many carriers at this point have wide support for SIP. However, every carrier is a little bit different. We'll talk about that at the end here. And one of the big reasons to move to SIP is less on-premise equipment is required, less connections are required. You're not going to need physical T1 cables going from device to device, for example. It's also much more flexible on the number of call paths and scalability, whereas something like a PRI is going to be limited to a maximum of 23 channels before you'd have to add another call path. Another PRI for extra call paths. SIP can be highly modular in that case. Scalability as well. You can add call paths on the fly with your carrier typically, and also redundancy. Redundancy is also typically easier through SIP. So there's a lot of big reasons to move in that direction. And there's a whole lot of different reasons to move to SIP as well. So redundancy is one of the big ones as well. Essentially with SIP, you can set up a number of redundant locations where calls can get routed intelligently if one endpoint is down. So if one circuit's down but your DR circuit is up, it's very easy to move those call paths from A to B for your carrier. And the call path flexibility is also nice. If you notice a trend with your business and you are needing to add additional call paths, there's no need to wait for construction or get a physical PRI brought into your building. This is something that your carrier can work with us on and make sure that we are able to move the call paths up for you without any additional gear required. SIP is also typically going to be much less expensive than a PRI. If you're looking at it like for like, call path for call path, typically SIP is going to be less expensive, again, because there's no need for that physical connectivity and gear. And it can be deployed in a variety of configurations, whether your carrier brings something on premise or you're simply delivering your traffic to the cloud where the carrier operates. There's a number of different ways that SIP can be put into your environment. Because of this, there's a number of different ways that we can actually set up SIP in the Mitel infrastructure. And it can be used with both the physical switches, such as the SG T1Ks or the newer ST switches in Connect. And it can also be used with a virtual trunk switch, which is a newer capability, especially if you're coming from a PRI. And there are a number of reasons to consider going with a virtual trunk switch over a physical. The first one, and potentially the biggest one, depending on what you are doing with your environment, is the media proxy capabilities. And let's talk about this for a second. What media proxy does is this is a piece of SIP that actually makes sure that the call audio stays going to the same destination and stays unhindered throughout the travel of the call as you transfer calls, add parties to the calls, record calls. These all require different commands and statements within SIP, whereas with a PRI, it's essentially just listening. So it is a little bit more complex that way. The media proxy capabilities on the physical switches, while they are present, are fairly limited. Typically, you are going to see with the older units, such as the SG units, you only have media proxy capability for 10 to 15 calls. At most, you will see around 20. And what this means is if you are in an environment that is recording all your calls, you're transferring people off auto attendants, you're adding people to three-way conferences, you're going to eat up that media proxy capability pretty fast. And then even though you may have more call paths here than you would for the rest of the calls, you are actually going to run into issues where you may have calls drop audio, especially after transfers, or agents that are recording calls may get a number of calls that don't have audio. This is something that the virtual trunk switches handle much better. The virtual trunk switches are set up in such a way that they have media proxy capabilities for every single call path that they support. So you're not going to run into this particular issue. The newer ST switches also have that capability, but that leads us to bullet point 2, which is more capacity for calls. Really the biggest advantage that you're going to have from a virtual switch in terms of capacity is just going to be simply being able to use one or two virtual trunk switches to handle all the calls that you need, because they have far more capacity than the physical switches. The physical switches, such as the T1Ks of the older SG variety, they can handle up to 24 SIP trunks, which is a fairly large amount. It's right around the amount that you would get for a PRI. And there are other switches that can handle more as well, such as an SG220T1, which can be configured to support up to 70 SIP trunks, although without the media proxy capabilities for all of those different call paths. The virtual trunk switch, on the other hand, though, can actually support up to 500 calls per trunk switch, and each one of these will have media proxy capabilities. Because of this, it's just a much more robust solution, especially if you're going to be scaling your audio, in order to make sure that you're able to add the call paths as needed without having to set up additional equipment or additional paths for the equipment that you'd have to work with the carrier on. You can set up one trunk switch, set up all the trunks that you need, and you should be good to go there. Other advantages of the virtual trunk switch: it has much better handling of hairpinning for audio. So hairpinning, this is going to be essentially the anchoring of audio to make sure it goes to the correct endpoint and stays there. This is something that is used to make sure that our connection to the carrier stays well. And the virtual trunk switches just handle hairpinning much better than any of the physical units as well. And then finally, and this one is probably a no-brainer for many people in here, The virtual switches just have more horsepower. Whereas you're using a smaller ARM processor in those physical units, the virtual switches are being run by a server grade processor at the host level. They just have more horsepower, they have more RAM availability, and that is a big reason why they have so much more capacity and so much more media proxy capabilities. They can just handle so much more. So as a result, the virtual trunk switch is simply superior to the physical switches in terms of getting set up for SIP. Now, there are a few things that you need to know in order to take a look at doing virtual architecture with SIP. And this actually does apply not just to the virtual switches, but this applies to the servers as well. But there's a few different things that you need to be aware of, and Inflow support can help you with this if you have questions. So there are currently 2 different hypervisors that are supported with virtual switches. It is going to depend on your versioning, and there is one caveat with Hyper-V, and we'll talk about that in a second here. But currently, Hyper-V and VMware are both supported. With VMware, it is definitely version dependent on the build of Director. The build notes for your version of Director will notate which versions of VMware have been configured and tested with your build. And it's very, very important to make sure that we stay in those guidelines. For a couple of reasons. The first one being that Mitel will not be able to support any version of VMware that's past the version that they tested on. And the other one, and I can speak to this from personal experience, is that we have seen a number of issues with the virtual switches in particular when the VMware version being used is not within that spec, such as switches falling over, failing to send calls through, and in the case of the virtual phone switches, failure for the phones to actually be able to communicate with the switches themselves. Inflow support can check this compatibility for you and advise you on any upgrade paths that you'd be looking for. So that would be what you would want to do there. And it's much the same for Hyper-V. The version dependent is going to be dependent on the build of Director. In most cases, that's going to be mostly for server architecture. And you will want to check with Inflow support for compatibility there. One big note on Hyper-V. Hyper-V for servers has been supported for a long time. However, if you're still on an older build of Connect, or if you are on ShoreTel 14.2, which was Connect's predecessor, Hyper-V did not yet have support for virtual switches because the file format was not something that Hyper-V could handle. So this is all stuff that Inflow support can take a look at and check out for you. If you do want to support your virtual infrastructure with Hyper-V, we can help you do that. We may just need to get a build upgrade set up for you depending on where you're at this time. Currently, there are no other hypervisors supported at this time. This includes Nutanix AHV and any other hypervisor. We've seen a few of these come through the woodwork in the last few months. We have tried to make it work, and unfortunately, we've run into a number of issues. Generally seems to be related around the NIC drivers for those hypervisors. So at this time, you want to make sure that you're sticking with VMware as well as Hyper-V. In the future, that may change. So if we do get any news that another hypervisor has been certified with Mitel, we will make sure to let you guys know as well. And the reason for those not being usable is because there is no testing or support available. And in our experience with several different hypervisors outside of VMware and Hyper-V, they can cause major issues with the switches. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about when to contact support. So here's just a few different reasons that you would contact support here. The first one here is if you want to change your hypervisor. And when I say change your hypervisor, I don't mean go from VMware to Hyper-V or to Nutanix or anything like that. I mean even things like, do you want to do an incremental upgrade on your hypervisor, on your host? You want to make sure that you contact us so that we can make sure that it's going to work with your gear. Because we just want to make sure that you're not going to have any unintended consequences if you do that. We do understand that you do want to get your systems upgraded. We just want to make sure that it's going to be in a state that's going to make sure that your voice equipment is going to be able to operate properly. If you want to change carriers, you definitely want to give us a call as well. Not all setups for SIP are the same. The best way that I can describe that is that SIP is kind of like VHS and Betamax from back in the day. They're very, very similar in the majority of cases. But every carrier, even the big carriers, have one or two differences in their configuration that need to be accounted for, especially on the Mitel platform. So what can happen is you can migrate from one carrier to the next. You can change the IPs. Everything will seem to work fine. And then you may have a few issues with particular call setups, like maybe outbound calls to a specific area code, or conferencing calls to 3 different people might be presenting with no audio. These are all reasons that you should contact support before you get that setup to change. We can advise you on anything that will be needed, and if needed, can help you set up any sort of testing and turn up that needs to be done. We can also help you plan with these. So if you're planning for future SIP trunks, or if you're planning for a new deployment, you're thinking about moving to SIP in the future, this is something that Inflow can help you out with as well. We work with SIP all the time, so we can advise you of a good plan to get going, help you out with a carrier selection, and also get that on the engineers' calendars so that they can get that configured, set up, tested, and make sure that the deployment of your SIP product will be seamless. And then finally, if you just have any questions about SIP deployments, so if you aren't sure about specific technologies, if it'll work for you, this is always a good time to come over to support and ask those questions. That way we can make sure that you're exactly where you need to be if and when you do choose to go with SIP down the road. In the future, we will have some more SIP content as well. One thing to keep in mind, because not all SIP setups are the same, if you do have any specific SIP questions, this would be something to start a ticket with our support about, so that we can take a look and figure out what might be going on for you. And with that in mind here, talking about questions, if you do have any questions, there's a questions box in your GoToWebinar application. This will allow you to send the questions straight to me. And if you have any here, I will get those answered. So I will go ahead and give you guys just a second here to send any questions that you have in. Looks like we currently don't have any at this point in time. How does faxing work in SIP environments? So faxing is its own special bit of fun when it comes to SIP. And the reason for that is that fax packets are specifically prone to having issues with any sort of connection problem. And the fun thing there is, because SIP is over the network and being transmitted over UDP, you can run into issues from time to time. Now, depending on your carrier, there is a protocol that can be used with the Mitel platform called T38. T38 is a store and forward protocol that will actually grab the entire bit of data on one side and then send it across. It will validate that everything has come through, and then it will process the fax. It does increase the time it takes to actually receive a fax, but greatly increases the probability that transmission will be successful. So if you're looking to do faxing over SIP, I would highly recommend finding a carrier that supports T38 faxing. Any other questions? We're using SIP currently, and our setup currently requires an ADTRAN as an SBC. Is there a Mitel appliance that would circumvent that, or is an ADTRAN required? So this is one of those things that's kind of a gray area in terms of what's going to be required between you and your carrier. In a lot of cases, a session border controller or an SBC is going to be required. Now, there's several that are capable of handling this. The most common ones that you'll see on the Mitel side will be the in-gate separator, as well as the ADTRAN device that is mentioned in the question here. As far as whether or not there's a Mitel specific device, currently there is not. Currently, the system is set up so that it can work with any session border controller as long as the session border controller is properly configured. And it is carrier dependent on whether or not the SBC will be required. So that would be the kind of question where we would want to jump into the system and vet it. If it was put in place by Inflow, more than likely the determination was made that that would be necessary in order to work with the carrier. Any other questions? All right, looks like that might be all of the questions here. And if anything else does come up, you can always reach out to us. If you come up with any questions after the fact, after the webinar is over, that's not an issue at all. You can always give us a call at 844-446-3569 or send us an email at contact@inflowcommunications.com. And we also will be posting this video as well as other videos, tidbits, articles, you name it, to our knowledge base. So you can always check out our knowledge base for more resources and videos. So with that, that is the end of our webinar for today. Again, my name is Tom Lyons, Senior Engineer with Inflow Communications. Thank you so much for attending today, and we do hope to see you in the future. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.